Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to QGTV Chapter Studies Ramadan 2011. We're on day 9 now, and today we'll be doing a pair of twin chapters. So this is chapter 10 and chapter 11. So firstly I'll need to explain what is a twin chapter. Well, a twin, as you can see obviously from the name, that they are a pair of sorts. So what makes them a pair? Well, firstly, there could be a similar tone, there could be a similar rhetoric, there could be a similar meter perhaps, but in the case of Yunus and Hud, there is a complementarity in how it explains itself, as we will soon come to see. So let's begin with chapter Yunus, chapter 10. Chapter Yunus begins a new set of chapters, which is the Alif Lam Ra set. That's from Yunus all the way to Al-Hijr, which is chapter 15. Chapter Yunus begins with the idea of man receiving revelation. So it asks us, are we amazed by this fact that a person receives revelation? So it then tells you how to understand if that revelation is in fact correct. The centrality of focus of chapter 10 is the Quran itself. So the Quran here is being used as a rhetorical device. And if we try to understand how the Quran is being used, we will understand the mentality or the mindset of this chapter. It mentions the Quran actually 3 times, from verses 15 to verses 17. Verse 15 is the famous verse which shows that Rasulullah cannot change the content of the Quran. He is to follow the Quran. And the Quran contains ayatun bayyinat, or clarifying revelations. So as we go along, the Quran sort of clarifies our personal human experience. And this is first mentioned in verse 15 to verse 17. Next we have verse 35 to 38, which talks about the Quran as a coherent discourse. So first it asks you, is there anything that can guide better than this? Most of mankind follow nothing but conjecture. That's verse 36. Then verse 37, the famous verse, which says, "Ma kana hadha al-Quran an yuftara min dunillah." Verily, this Quran is essentially nothing that can be produced by other than Allah. Now, why is this? Because it is a true prediction of the human condition. And then it asks you in verse 38, if you are in doubt, produce a surah like this. A surah is a coherent discourse. So can you produce something like this? Next, the third occurrence of the Quran in chapter 10 starts with verse 57, which is the sole call to mankind, which says, Ya ayyuhan nas, قَدْ جَاءَتْكُمْ مَوِذَةٌ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ. There has come to you a sermon from your Lord. So it now talks about the Quran as mawidha, or as a sermon, and it continues to say that in whatever business you may be, or whatever you are practicing from the Quran, Allah is witness thereof. Now this echoes verse 41, chapter 41 verse 53, which is about the proof of the Quran. So here it shows the Quran's absolute observance, or observation, of our human experience. And then it continues to say, verily on the awliya, or allies of Allah, there will be no fear, nor shall they grieve. So you can see how the Quran is being used now as a device for us to practice the signs which we receive. Next we come to a few narrations the story of Nuh and the story of Musa. So two narrations, sorry. And the story of Nuh is very brief. It's only four verses, which talks about rejection of the message and the destruction that follows. The story of Musa comes after that, verse 75 to verse 93, so it's fairly long, 20 verses. And then again it focuses on the defeat and destruction of Fir'aun, the Pharaoh. Now, the famous verse, verse 87, which tells Musa and Harun to build houses, buyut, or systems within Egypt. That's in this passage. That's verse 87. And as soon as you do that, the good news comes to the believers, the destruction of oppression comes. And that's the destruction of Fir'aun. So we need to link all these themes together so that we understand exactly what this chapter is getting at. The end of this chapter comes the summation, which is essentially, again, God says, O mankind, there comes to you the truth from your Lord. So whoever follows it, follows the guidance, does so for his own souls. Then the last verse says, وَاتَّبِعْ مَا يُوحَى إِلَيْكَ. So follow the inspiration sent to you. وَأَصْبِرْ حَتَّى يَحْكُمُ اللَّهِ. And be steadfast until comes the judgment of Allah. What's the judgment of Allah? Here we can see when you are, if you have already given the message and people still keep into their, still keep following their ways of error, then the judgment of Allah will come. So that's the end of Yunus. Now, if you notice here, the verbs, or rather the commands, the commands given are in singular. For example, verse 105, which says, وَأَنْ أَقِيمْ وَجَهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا. Akim, the word akim, or establish, is in singular. Wajhaka, which comes afterwards, your face, is also in singular. So here we can see that this verse, it is a singular focus on the reader, and the reader is then enjoined to take forward the message. So that's Yunus chapter 10.